Section 1. The World Before the Bombs. There is something quietly beautiful about standing at the edge of something broken and trying to imagine what it looked like whole. The Fallout universe was whole once. Not in any simple way, and not in any way that most people would call perfect, but it was alive. Cities hummed, factories churned, children ran under a sun that had not yet been swallowed by fire. And underneath all of that warmth, underneath all of that bright chrome and neon promise, something was already rotting. That is where this journey begins. Not in the wasteland, not among the ruins, but in the world that produced them. Because the greatest mystery that Fallout has ever posed is not what the bombs did. It is what caused them to fall in the first place, and whether the civilization that built them ever deserved to survive. Picture the United States of the mid-20th century, but stretched forward in time in the strangest possible way. The architecture stays Art Deco, all sweeping curves and bold angles and the optimism of an era that believed in the power of design. The fashion stays tailored, the music stays crooning and bright. But beneath that frozen aesthetic, nuclear technology advanced at a pace our own history could never match. Fission power became dominant. Atom-powered cars rolled off assembly lines. Households hummed with energy pulled from the core of the universe itself. And the country wore this like a crown. This was not ignorance. This was a deliberate aesthetic. The leaders of that world were deeply invested in the idea that progress looked a certain way, that America looked a certain way, and that anything which contradicted the image needed to be corrected or suppressed. That tension between the beautiful surface and the ugly machinery underneath is the real foundation of everything Fallout ever built. The cracks started showing in the year 2052. By that point, the world had consumed itself. Oil reserves, once vast enough that entire economies floated on them, were approaching something close to empty. Not entirely gone, but scarce enough that the scarcity itself became a weapon. Nations that had organized their entire identity around the extraction and sale of petroleum found themselves facing an existential reckoning. And when nations face existential reckonings, they rarely respond with patience. This period, running from 2052 onward, is what the lore calls the Resource Wars. It began with Europe, of all places, as the European Commonwealth launched military campaigns against the oil-producing nations of the Middle East. Those conflicts burned hot and brutal, and they did not resolve cleanly. The United Nations, already struggling under the weight of a world whose fundamental economics were collapsing, attempted to intervene. It failed. The body dissolved completely in the year 2053. And with it went the last formal architecture of international cooperation that the planet had. What replaced it was something harder, something older. The simple and unlovely logic of whoever has the most firepower makes the rules. China was suffering badly. Its economy had become dependent on oil in ways that its leadership had underestimated, and now with the global supply contracting and the price of access spiraling upward, the entire foundation of the state was under pressure. In 2066, China made a decision that would define the next decade of history. It invaded Alaska. The reasoning was cold and practical. Alaska held oil pipeline infrastructure, it held reserves, and it held the symbolic weight of American territory, which meant that seizing it would force America into a confrontational posture that China believed it could manage. Under the command of General Jingwei, Chinese forces landed in winter conditions, executed a massive coordinated assault, and secured control of the Alaskan oil pipeline and its reserves. American forces retreated on nearly every front. What followed was a grinding war of attrition set against ice and wind, and the particular misery of a conflict fought at the edge of the world. China authorized the use of biological weapons on the Alaskan front. America began pouring resources into a technological countermeasure that would change the nature of warfare on the ground. Power armor, military-grade exosuits that allowed soldiers to absorb punishment and exert force beyond anything the human body could manage alone began to roll out to American forces. General Constantine Chase commanded the American response, and slowly, agonizingly, the tide began to shift. By early 2077, Anchorage was liberated. The Chinese supply lines had been severed and shattered by sustained bombardment and the advance of armored units. The Alaskan reclamation operation was declared a success. A memorial was constructed in Washington, and for a brief window, Americans who paid attention to the broader situation could believe that the worst was over. It was not over. Because while American forces were reclaiming Alaska, the country had already made another decision that would never be undone. Canada, its neighbor, its friend, its partner of long historical standing, had been annexed. Not asked, not negotiated with. Absorbed, because America needed its resources and because the logic of the moment was that need superseded courtesy. Canadian civilians protested. Canadian freedom fighters organized. American elite units were deployed to suppress them, and suppression in this context meant exactly what it sounds like. The border that had once been a friendly fiction between two nations became the border between an occupied people and their occupiers. The Sino-American War technically ended when Anchorage was reclaimed, but the world did not become safer. On March of 2077, something extraordinary happened that almost nobody at the time understood the full significance of. The President of the United States left Washington. He moved to a location described in press reports with careful vagueness, somewhere off the coast, somewhere secure, somewhere away from the targets that any rational enemy would prioritize. The Boston Bugle, one of the newspapers of record at the time, published a piece noting that this move gave credence to long-running rumors of a secret militarized shadow government. Most readers probably filed that under the category of things that powerful people do, that ordinary people are not meant to fully understand. They were right about not understanding. What they could not have known was that the organization described by the newspaper as a rumored shadow government was entirely real, had been operational for decades, and had spent the intervening time quietly building the infrastructure necessary to survive what it already believed was coming. The Enclave, as it called itself, was not reacting to the crisis. It had predicted it, and it had prepared accordingly. The vaults were part of that preparation. The official story was generous and reassuring. Vault Tech Corporation, commissioned by the government through a program called Project Safe House that began construction in 2054, was building a network of underground shelters, 122 of them, scattered across the American continent, each capable of housing 1,000 citizens. The marketing was warm. The brochures were printed in colors that evoked optimism. The whole presentation was designed to make Americans feel cared for, looked after, sheltered by the same corporate and governmental machinery that had built the highways and the cities and the atom-powered future they were all living inside. The real story was not warm. The vaults were not built to save people. They were built to study them. Each vault was designed around an experiment. Not a safety measure, not a practical test of emergency procedures, but a scientific inquiry into human behavior under conditions of extreme stress and complete isolation. The people who entered those vaults on October 23, 2077, did so believing they were being protected. They had no way of knowing they were being enrolled, without consent, into what was probably the most comprehensive and most callous set of social experiments in the history of human civilization. The bombs themselves fell quickly. The Great War, as it came to be known, began and ended on the same single day, October 23, 2077. Unknown objects were spotted at 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, off the California coast. By 3:37, a squadron of high-altitude aircraft had been identified near the Bering Strait and believed to be Chinese in origin. At least one Chinese stealth submarine, a vessel later known as the Yangtze, moved close to the American East Coast and launched nearly all of its warheads, holding back only one due to a malfunction. 6 hours after the initial sighting, at 9:13 in the morning, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System registered the first 4 confirmed missile launches. The United States went to DEFCON 2. Then things happened very fast, and then things did not happen anymore. The exact origin of the first strike has never been definitively established in the lore, and this ambiguity is not an oversight. It is intentional. Who launched first? Was it the United States? Was it China? Was it some third party whose interest in global catastrophe exceeded the comprehension of either major power? The lore gestures at the question and then leaves it open, like a wound that nobody closed. What is clear is the aftermath. In roughly 2 hours, the civilization that had spent a century telling itself it was building towards something better was reduced to fire and ash, and the long, slow silence of a world that had nothing left to say. Cities vanished. The geography of continents changed. The atmosphere filled with particulates that would alter weather patterns for generations. And deep underground, in sealed steel chambers, A fragment of the human population began a new chapter of existence that none of them had chosen, and all of them were completely unprepared for. The retro-futuristic optimism of the pre-war world, all that chrome and neon and cheerful atomic energy, did not die on the day of the bombs. It persisted underground, in the vaults, in the terminals that kept running after their operators were gone, in the advertisements that continued to play to empty rooms about a future that had already been canceled. It persisted in memory, in the stories that survivors told their children about before, stories that became more golden with each retelling until the word before stopped meaning a specific historical period and started meaning paradise. The nostalgia of the wasteland for a world it never actually had is one of the series' most quietly devastating themes. Before the war, the United States had a system of civil defense propaganda that the government used to reassure its population that nuclear war was survivable, manageable, something that sensible precautions and a positive attitude could see you through. The familiar face of Vault Boy, the cheerful mascot that appears throughout the series, belongs to this tradition. The grinning figure giving a thumbs up to everything from radiation exposure to decapitation is not satirical in its context. It is the logical extension of a culture that had decided the best response to existential terror was enforced optimism, that the way to keep people functional in the face of a threat they could not meaningfully control was to make the threat seem manageable. Whether the people who designed this system believed it, whether the architects of the Vault program genuinely thought cheerful branding could offset the reality of what was being built beneath the country's surface, is one of those questions the lore leaves unanswered. The simplest reading is that the Enclave, which had a significant hand in shaping both the Vault program and the public perception of it, was operating with the cold pragmatism of people who had already decided the population was a resource rather than a constituency. In that reading, the Vault Boy smiling through a nuclear blast is not optimism but management. Keep the subjects calm while the real plans are being made elsewhere. The annexation of Canada is one of the pre-war events that the series touches on repeatedly without ever fully exploring. The lore describes it as an economic decision, driven by America's need for Canadian resources as the global situation deteriorated. But the manner in which it was carried out, the deployment of elite military units to suppress civil unrest, the public executions of protesters that the Steam Guide on pre-war lore references, the transformation of a friendly neighboring country into an occupied territory speaks to a depth of domestic moral failure that the American cultural self-image of the pre-war period was completely unable to accommodate. The American propaganda machine of the 21st century had very specific ways of describing what America was and what America did. Those descriptions did not include occupying neighboring democracies. They did not include executing civilians who protested that occupation. The gap between the story America told itself about its own nature and the actions America was actually taking in the years before the war is one of the deeper seams of irony that the series mines throughout its runtime. It is also, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, not entirely alien to readers of actual 20th century history. The gap between stated ideals and implemented policy, between the country a government describes and the country a government runs, is a feature of most human political systems rather than a flaw unique to the Fallout universe's dystopian alternate timeline. What the Fallout universe does is dial the contrast up until it is impossible to ignore, until the cheerful music playing in the background of a world that is visibly collapsing becomes its own kind of argument about the relationship between official narratives and material reality. The American settlers who were displaced by the expansion of mining and military operations in the pre-war decades, the workers who built the vaults without being told what they were really for, the prisoners who were subjected to FEV experiments at Mariposa, the Canadian civilians who were occupied by a country that described itself as the land of the free, all of these populations exist in the lore as context rather than subject. The games generally follow characters with enough social position to navigate the systems that crushed other people. But the systems are visible in the background if you look for them, in the terminal entries and holotapes and environmental details that document who was being spent in the process of building the bright future that the pre-war promotional materials were advertising. The pre-war world of Fallout is not, in the end, a simple cautionary tale about nuclear weapons. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when a civilization optimizes for self-image over self-awareness, when the distance between the story it tells about itself and the reality it is creating becomes wide enough that the civilization can no longer correct course. By 2077, that distance had become unbridgeable. It persisted in the vaults, it persisted in the signage and the music and the advertisements that continued to play on screens that nobody was watching. It persisted in the ideology of the Enclave, which believed that the America it had preserved was worth rebuilding, even if the rebuilding required the elimination of everyone who had survived outside its control. That is the world Fallout grew out of. Not a simple story of humanity making one catastrophic mistake, but a long and deeply human process of choosing convenience over conscience, choosing control over cooperation, choosing the clean story over the complicated truth, until the complicated truth accumulated enough pressure to take the roof off everything. There is a particular kind of horror in a world where the people who caused the catastrophe plan to emerge from it in command, and a particular kind of dark satisfaction in the fact that it almost worked. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. Whether it is midnight in Melbourne or 3 in the morning in Montreal, there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that the same quiet lore is reaching people across the whole map. And if you find yourself settling into these stories, consider subscribing. There is a lot more of this ahead. Section 2. Vault-Tech's Long Experiment. The first thing you need to understand about the vaults is that they worked exactly as intended, not as the occupants intended, not as the people huddled in the long lines on October 23rd intended, clutching whatever they could carry, trusting a company and a government that had already decided to use them. The vaults worked as Vault-Tech intended, which means that inside those sealed steel chambers, people were sorted and studied and subjected to conditions their handlers had designed specifically to push them toward breaking points, and the data from each collapse was dutifully recorded by systems that kept running long after anyone was left to read the output. The sheer breadth of what these vaults were designed to do is staggering when you lay it out in full. Vault 11 sits in the Mojave, and what happened there is probably the purest expression of what Vault-Tech was actually trying to learn. The occupants of Vault 11 were told, from the moment they arrived, that a sacrifice was required. One person, chosen by the population every single year. If the sacrifice was made, the vault would continue operating. If it was refused, the entire population would be killed. This was the experiment. Not the sacrifice itself, but the social structures that emerged around the necessity of choosing who among you would die. And the occupants of Vault 11, being human beings in an impossible situation, did what human beings do. They built a civilization around the sacrifice. Political parties emerged. Factions developed different philosophies about who should be chosen. The powerful found ways to exempt themselves. The vulnerable were repeatedly selected. A social hierarchy crystallized around the logic of the sacrifice, with all the corruption and manipulation and quiet desperation that accompanies any system where survival is the prize and the powerful make the rules. For 75 years, this continued. Then 5 people refused. A group of 5 occupants declared that they would no longer participate. They refused to name a candidate. The vault's automated systems responded with lethal force and killed nearly everyone inside. The 5 survivors, walking through the aftermath of what their refusal had produced, received a message from the vault systems. The message told them that the sacrifice had never been necessary. The entire premise had been a lie from the beginning. The vault's automated defenses had activated to punish the refusal, yes, but there was no external authority waiting for its annual offering. There was just a machine running an experiment about the lengths to which people would go when sufficiently frightened. The 5 survivors could not live with what they learned. The terminal logs from Vault 11 are among the most devastating pieces of writing in the entire series. Compare this to what happened in Vault 112, located in the Capital Wasteland, where the approach was entirely different but the fundamental disregard for the people inside was exactly the same. Vault 112's occupants were placed in suspended animation and connected to a virtual reality simulation. The architect of this simulation was a scientist named Stanislaus Braun, and Braun was many things, most of them terrible. He designed a persistent simulation that the residents experienced as a small town called Tranquility Lane, trapped in a loop of the 1950s, and then he positioned himself as an invisible god within it. Braun was still there when the player character from Fallout 3 arrived, centuries later, still playing, still controlling. The occupants of Tranquility Lane had lived and died and lived again across simulated lifetimes. never knowing that the cheerful suburban existence they were experiencing was a construction, and that the man responsible for it had a sadistic streak that 200 years of absolute power had done nothing to temper. What makes Vault 112 disturbing in a specific way is that it did not require physical cruelty. The people in the pods were not being hurt in any direct sense. They were being kept, like specimens in a collection, for the amusement and academic interest of a single man who had decided that the apocalypse was, for him personally, an opportunity. Vault 101, from the same game, operated on a different and arguably more psychologically sophisticated set of premises. It was one of the only vaults that was explicitly never meant to open. Not on a schedule. Not when conditions outside improved. The doors of Vault 101 were engineered to remain sealed indefinitely, and the overseer of each generation was tasked with ensuring that the population never seriously considered leaving. The experiment was not about sacrifice or virtual reality. It was about authority. About how authority legitimizes itself in a closed system where there is no outside standard to appeal to. Each successive overseer became the definition of the possible, the acceptable, and the true, not because they were wise or right, but because the architecture of the vault gave them no competition. The player character in Fallout 3 was born in that vault, and the story of the game begins with their father's escape, which shatters the closed logic of the system and forces a confrontation with everything the Overseer's authority had been built to prevent. Then there is Vault 81, in the Commonwealth, which tells a different kind of story. This vault was designed as a medical research facility. The occupants were to be unwitting subjects for experiments aimed at developing cures for every disease known to pre-war science, with the treatments delivered through the vault's water and air systems without their knowledge or consent. The researcher assigned to run the program had a crisis of conscience. He sabotaged most of the experiment before it could be fully implemented, and because of his intervention, Vault 81 became one of the few vaults in the entire network that ended up functioning more or less as advertised. The people inside were not subjected to systematic harm. The community survived. By the time the player encounters it, Vault 81 is a functioning settlement with a doctor, a school, and the ordinary texture of daily life. But the sabotage was incomplete. One prototype disease escaped the researcher's intervention and persisted in the vault's sublevels, infecting mole rats and creating the conditions for a very specific side quest that the game uses to explore the question of whether a person would sacrifice a child's well-being for their own survival. The fact that the experiment mostly failed is treated in the game as a reason for hope. The fact that it would have succeeded if not for one scientist's conscience is not. Vault 29, referenced in the lore and detailed in the Fallout Bible, pursued an experiment in deliberate family destruction. The selection criteria for entry specified that only children under the age of 15 would be admitted. Parents were separated from their children and directed to other vaults. Families were fractured at the vault door. The experiment was designed to study the development of social structure and authority in a population that had never known adult governance, that had grown up entirely among peers, that had been stripped of the generational transmission of knowledge and norms that constitutes the invisible backbone of any functioning society. What does a civilization look like when its founding generation never had parents to model themselves on? Vault 29 was built to find out. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth, took a different approach. The occupants were a carefully selected group of people with histories of substance dependency who had been clean for a defined period before entering. The vault was stocked with abundant resources, stable conditions, and every support structure that recovery depends on. For 5 years, the experiment provided everything necessary to sustain the sobriety of its population. Then, in the 5th year, a hidden cache of chems was deliberately revealed. The experiment was studying how long maintained stability could hold against the introduction of a controlled temptation, and what the social consequences of that rupture would look like. The vault collapsed into violence within days. These experiments, taken together, describe an organization that was not studying human survival at all. Vault Tech was studying human failure. The conditions of each vault were designed not to give people the best possible chance, but to create the specific pressures most likely to reveal the points at which human societies fracture. The data collected was intended to be used in the construction of a post-war civilization that would be immune to those failure modes, a civilization engineered by people who had decided in advance that the lessons of the old world needed to be baked into the foundations of the new one. Who commissioned these experiments? The Enclave had significant influence over Vault-Tech's operations. The deep state apparatus that planned for and accepted the inevitability of nuclear war was the same apparatus that decided the survivors would be studied. The vaults were not shelters with experimental components. They were experimental facilities with shelter as the packaging. The question of what happened to all that data is one that the lore has never fully answered. Some of it presumably ended up in the hands of Institute researchers, who were building their own experiments on the surface. Some of it was destroyed when the Enclave's oil rig was obliterated by the Chosen One in Fallout 2. Some of it sits in sealed terminals across the wasteland, accessible to anyone patient enough to find the right location and literate enough to understand what they are reading. And then there are the vaults that the lore mentions but does not fully explain. Vault 24 appears in fragments, hinted at through console command artifacts in Fallout New Vegas. Its experiment is not detailed. Its outcome is not documented. It exists as a whisper in the files, a number with no story attached to it, which is in some ways more unsettling than any of the documented horrors. The Unknown Vault, the experiment that nobody recorded or perhaps nobody survived to record. Vault 92, which appears in the Fallout 3 DLC content and is one of the more genuinely disturbing experiments in the documented record, was designed around a population of professional musicians. The selection criteria for occupancy specified individuals with significant musical training and performance background. The vault was equipped with high-quality musical instruments and recording facilities. It seemed, by the standards of what the program was doing, almost kind. A vault for artists, offering the cultural richness of music as a counterweight to the psychological pressure of underground life. What the musicians were not told was that the white noise conditioning systems installed in the vault were also delivering subliminal audio signals designed to trigger violent episodes. The experiment was studying the conditions under which creative and culturally sophisticated individuals could be pushed to violence. Specifically, it was studying whether targeted psychological conditioning could transform the vault's population into something useful for military applications. A population of highly skilled individuals who could, under specific audio triggers, be induced to attack designated targets. The vault descended into a bloodbath. The logs that survived describe a community that knew something was wrong, that could feel the episodes coming and could not stop them, that watched itself disintegrate with a clarity that made the disintegration worse. The musicians of Vault 92 were, by the end, keenly aware that they were being manipulated and completely unable to do anything about it. The experiment at Vault 77 is much simpler, and in some ways much more darkly comic. One man, one crate of puppets. The vault was designed for a population of 1,000, stocked for a population of 1,000, and received an occupant of 1. The record suggests this was not an accident. The purpose of the experiment was to observe the psychological deterioration of long-term isolation in a context of material abundance. The subject had everything he could have needed except other people. What the subject actually did, based on the records that survive, involved an elaborate and increasingly complex relationship with the puppets that began as entertainment and evolved into something that the clinical observer's notes describe with visible discomfort. He survived, eventually emerging to the wasteland surface when the vault's isolation became genuinely intolerable. What he found outside was the capital wasteland, several decades into the post-war period, and his subsequent fate is not documented in the available records. Vault 3, by contrast, was not the result of a designed experiment at all. It was one of the few vaults that appears to have functioned more or less as advertised. A genuine shelter with reasonable conditions and a population that managed to develop a stable community. The experiment assigned to Vault 3 was relatively mild by the standards of the program, involving water rationing rather than psychological manipulation or violence. The vault survived its designated period, and its residents opened the door when conditions outside seemed manageable. They were killed by the Fiends, a gang of chem addicts who found the vault's resources too attractive to leave in the hands of its original occupants. The tragedy of Vault 3 is that it might have been the success story of the whole program. The proof that a vault could actually function as a shelter and produce a viable community, if the community it produced had not emerged into a world that was not yet safe for communities that did not have the strength to defend themselves. The story of Vault-Tec is ultimately the story of what happens when the people in charge of protecting you have decided, before the crisis even arrives, that your life is less valuable than the data your suffering can generate. It is a story about power and its relationship to care, about the difference between appearing to protect someone and actually doing so, about the long distance between a brochure and the truth. Every vault door that opened onto a wasteland full of bones and broken systems was, in its own way, the experiment concluding. Section 3. The Institute and its Silences. If Vault-Tec represents the horror of what human beings will do to other human beings when they have been given permission by authority and insulated from consequence, then the Institute represents something subtler and perhaps more troubling. The horror of what human beings will do to themselves when they have decided that they are different from other human beings. When they have decided that the category of person that deserves moral consideration does not include the people outside their walls. The Institute grew out of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, a prestigious pre-war research university located in what is now the Greater Boston metropolitan area. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, the faculty and students and staff of that institution did what the institution had always trained them to do. They solved the problem. The problem being that the surface was no longer compatible with the survival of people who valued their lives, and the solution being to go underground, to build, and to keep building. 2 centuries later, the result of that continuous building was one of the most technologically advanced organizations on the North American continent. The Institute had mastered gene therapy, robotics, artificial intelligence, agricultural science capable of feeding populations without sunlight, and, most notoriously, the engineering of synthetic human beings indistinguishable from biological ones. But here's the thing that the Institute's brilliance tends to obscure. The Institute, for all its technical sophistication, had built a world without a window. Not literally. They had access to the surface. They could and did send agents and constructs into the Commonwealth. But the people who lived inside the Institute, who were born there and educated there, and who structured their entire understanding of the world around the Institute's values and methods, had no real contact with the civilization that had grown up in the centuries of their absence. They looked at the wasteland through the lens of researchers examining a habitat, not through the lens of people recognizing neighbors. When the player character of Fallout 4 finally reaches the Institute, the experience is jarring precisely because the facility is clean and bright and functional, and the people inside it seem, on the surface, reasonable. Scientists in lab coats moving through well-lit corridors, talking about research initiatives and department budgets, and the peculiarities of their colleagues. It looks like a university. It feels like a place where smart people are doing serious work. And some of them are. The agricultural research is genuinely valuable. The medical research has produced treatments that could meaningfully reduce suffering in the Commonwealth. There are people inside the Institute who have dedicated their entire lives to problems that matter. But the Institute, as an organization, had made a decision early in its history that poisoned everything that grew from it. It had decided that the people of the wasteland were not the Institute's responsibility, that the surface was an interesting research environment, not a community with claims on the Institute's resources or conscience, that the development of synthetic humans for the Institute's own purposes was a legitimate use of the Institute's capabilities regardless of what those synthetics might eventually experience. The synth question sits at the center of everything the Institute touches, and it is genuinely one of the most carefully unresolved moral puzzles the Fallout series has ever constructed. Generation 3 synths, the ones at the heart of the controversy, are biologically identical to humans in every measurable way. They have organic bodies grown from human DNA, they process information, form memories, respond to emotional stimuli, develop preferences and aversions, and the beginnings of what any reasonable outside observer would describe as a personality. Nick Valentine, a synth with decades of accumulated experience in the Commonwealth, expresses longing and grief and loyalty in ways that are qualitatively indistinguishable from the same emotions in biological humans. The Institute's official position was that synths are machines. Sophisticated machines, the most sophisticated ever built, but machines without interiority, without experience, without the quality that would make harm to them a moral matter rather than a maintenance concern. The game never settles this question. It puts it in the player's hands and steps back. But the Institute's behavior tells its own story. The Synth Retention Bureau, a department dedicated to retrieving escaped synths and returning them to Institute control, does not operate the way you would expect an organization to operate if it genuinely believed its products were non-experiencing machines. You do not devote significant organizational resources to recovering a toaster. The intensity of the effort to retrieve escaped synths suggests, without ever stating outright, that the Institute at some level understood that what was escaping was not just property. Father, the director of the Institute in Fallout 4, is the biological son of the player character. His name is Sean. He was taken from Vault 111 as an infant in 2227, raised by the Institute, and eventually became the scientist who solved the problem of third-generation synth production by using his own pre-war DNA as the biological foundation. His DNA was the key, because it was uncorrupted by 2 centuries of radiation exposure, genetically pristine in a way that the Institute's own researchers could not replicate from available samples. So, Sean built the synths. Sean ran the Institute. And when Sean was dying of cancer, he made a decision that is either deeply human or deeply manipulative, depending on how you interpret it. He orchestrated the release of his parent from cryogenic stasis, constructed a trail of breadcrumbs that would lead them to the Institute, and positioned himself as the answer to a question they had been asking since the moment they woke up. He also created a synth child, a perfect replica of himself at the age he was when he was taken, built from his own DNA, to serve as an emotional test, or a gift, or an apology. The game is genuinely ambiguous about this. What does it mean to give someone the child you were, in a form that will never grow old and never leave? Is it cruelty? Or is it the most intimate gesture of love available to a man whose understanding of love had been shaped entirely by a facility that treated human beings as experimental subjects? Sean's holotape, given to the player by the synth child after the Institute's destruction, contains his final words. He acknowledges the ambiguity. He admits that his choices were not clean. He asks, with something that reads like genuine uncertainty, whether the synth child might be given a chance. What the Institute represents in the end is not pure evil, though it produced genuinely evil things. It represents the tragedy of intelligence that has become untethered from empathy, of a community so convinced of its own exceptionalism that it lost the capacity to recognize the humanity it was surrounded by, including the humanity of the things it was building. The synth, known as Nick Valentine, presents the most human legible version of the Institute's legacy. Valentine has memories that do not belong to him biologically, memories of a pre-war man named Nick Valentine, a detective who worked in Boston before the bombs fell, who was in love and planning a future, and who was killed in a manner that the game gradually reveals through the course of the Far Harbor expansion. Those memories were used as the foundation for the synth's personality architecture. The synth woke up not knowing he was a synth, believing himself to be Nick Valentine, and spent a significant period in Diamond City's memory, not quite right, before coming to terms with what he was, and deciding that Nick Valentine, the man whose memories he carries, was worth honoring through the way he chose to live. Valentine, by the time the player meets him, has built something: a detective agency, a reputation for fair dealing and for helping people who do not have power, a set of relationships that, by any reasonable metric, constitute a community. He is also carrying grief, the grief of a man who lost someone he loved, encoded into his neural architecture and experienced as genuine loss rather than data. He knows he is not Nick Valentine. He does not believe this means Nick Valentine's experience of loss does not matter. The Institute's official position was that this kind of development was an acceptable side effect of advanced design, not a reason to reconsider whether what they were creating had interests that deserved consideration. The unofficial position, detectable in the private holotapes of individual researchers, was more complicated. Madison Lee, one of the Institute's senior scientists who eventually defects to the Brotherhood of Steel, had expressed discomfort with the child synth project. Other researchers had noted things about the behavior of escaped synths that the official reports did not include. The Institute knew what it was making. It had decided that the question of what that meant was not its problem. The coursers, the Institute's field operatives, are another thread that sits unresolved in the lore. They are synths, third generation like Valentine, but they have been trained and conditioned to perform the retrieval function of the Synth Retention Bureau. They are exceptionally capable, extraordinarily difficult to kill, and loyal to the Institute in ways that the general population of third generation synths clearly is not. The question of what that loyalty is built on, whether it is conditioning or genuine alignment with the Institute's values, or something more complicated than either, is never fully addressed. There is one courser, designated Z-47, who the player must track down as part of the main Fallout 4 questline. The encounter with this individual is brief and almost entirely action-focused, but the terminal entries that precede it hint at an entity who has been operational for an extended period, who has completed a significant number of retrieval missions, and who has developed an operational style that the Synth Retention Bureau's supervisors describe with something close to admiration. Whether a courser who has been retrieving escaped synths for years, who has witnessed the conditions of freedom that the escaped synths were trying to reach, who has returned them anyway, whether that entity has an internal life that processes the contradiction is not something the game directly addresses. But the game's architecture suggests the question is not entirely absent from the fiction. The courser's designation is not a name. The Institute does not name its tools. What the courser is called by itself, in whatever private space its cognition inhabits, is not documented. The Institute is gone by the end of Fallout 4, whichever faction destroys it. Its work continues, scattered across the Commonwealth in the form of synths who are now free, in the form of agricultural techniques that people have begun using without fully understanding where they came from, in the form of a question about consciousness that nobody has answered and the wasteland is not yet equipped to address. The silence where the Institute used to be says more than most of the dialogue ever did. Section 4. The Children of Adam and the Crater. There is a place in the Southern Commonwealth where the land itself has been changed into something that does not obey the ordinary rules of the world. The glowing sea, as the survivors call it, is the direct impact zone of one of the nuclear strikes from October 23rd. The bombs that fell elsewhere transformed their surroundings into wasteland, irradiated and hostile but navigable, recoverable in the long view. What fell in the Southern Commonwealth created something different. The glowing sea is luminous. Not metaphorically, the ground itself radiates a cold light that is visible at night, emanating from the pulverized soil and the shattered rock and the ruins of whatever existed here before. Perpetual storms cycle through the area, thick with contamination. The ruins of settlements that have no names anymore sink into a landscape that is still geologically unstable 200 years after the strike. Deathclaws nest here, and their exposure to the concentrated radiation of the impact zone has produced mutations even more extreme than the norm. Rad scorpions of unusual size, ferals with a degree of physical deterioration that suggests decades of continuous exposure, even by the standards of a world where radiation is everywhere. Most people who enter the glowing sea do not come back. The Children of Adam made it their home. The Children of Adam are the most fascinating and the most genuinely ambiguous faction in the Fallout universe, and they become more complex the longer you spend with them. On the surface, they read as a straightforward entry in the genre of post-apocalyptic cults, people who responded to an incomprehensible catastrophe by building a religious framework around it. The Great War, in their theology, was not a human mistake or a political failure. It was a divine act. Atom, the deity they worship, split himself in the Great Division, the nuclear event, and in doing so created the irradiated world, which is not a ruined version of something better but the intended form of Atom's creation. Radiation in this framework is not contamination, it is the glow of the divine. The early history of the Children of Adam is tied to Megaton, the settlement in the capital wasteland built inside a bomb crater. At the center of Megaton sat an unexploded nuclear device, and the sect that would become the Children of Adam grew up around that bomb, worshipping it. Confessor Cromwell, who appears in Fallout 3 as an older man with the weathered patience of someone who has been giving the same sermon for a very long time, was the public face of the cult during those years. He arrived in his early 20s and spent the subsequent decades preaching to anyone who would listen, and even to many who would not. The cult split in the years between Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. One group, led by Mother Isolde, traveled south toward the Commonwealth and settled in the Crater of Adam, the impact point at the center of the glowing sea. This group became among the most isolated of all the children's communities, building their settlement directly in the most heavily irradiated zone in the region. The other faction traveled north to the island off the coast of Maine that the game refers to as the Island, settling eventually in a decommissioned naval vessel they called the Nucleus. Both communities shared the core theology but developed distinct expressions of it. In Far Harbor, the expansion that explores the northern island community in the greatest depth, the children of Adam are led by High Confessor Tectus, a man whose zeal has curdled into authoritarianism. The community has been at war with the human settlement of Far Harbor, and the escalating conflict between them forms the structural spine of the expansion's story. The fog that blankets the island, the unusual radiation concentrations that have driven mutation in the local wildlife into patterns not seen elsewhere, and the strange history of the naval facility they inhabit all contribute to an atmosphere that the expansion uses extremely well. But the most interesting element of the children of Adam in Far Harbor is a figure who may not exist at all. The Mother of the Fog is the most revered figure in the island community's theology. She is described as one of the original children to settle the island, a holy figure who led the community from Far Harbor to the nucleus after they were exiled by the town's residents. She is believed by some members of the community to be a spirit. She is believed by others to be a hermit who occasionally intervenes in the community's affairs and who made most of the shrines that dot the island's geography. What makes the Mother of the Fog a genuine mystery is that there is physical evidence of her existence in the form of the shrines, in the form of holotapes she apparently recorded, in the form of a specific house near the area where the player character encounters her that contains stealth technology and anti-radiation medication alongside notes whose content is deliberately ambiguous. Was she a real woman using technological camouflage to create the impression of supernatural appearances? Was she a hallucination produced by long-term radiation exposure in a community whose theology primed them to see divine messengers? Was she genuinely something that the physical laws of the Fallout universe do not have adequate vocabulary to describe? The game does not answer this. The island's fog swallows the question. What is perhaps most remarkable about the children of Adam as a fictional creation is that the game takes their theology more seriously than most fiction takes its fictional religions. The question of whether they are right, whether Adam is real, whether the radiation that fills the wasteland carries some quality that transcends its physical effects is never definitively resolved. There are members of the community who are genuinely immune to radiation in ways that cannot be fully explained by the biological processes we understand. There are places in the Fallout universe where things happen that resist purely material explanation. The children of Adam looked at a catastrophe and chose to find meaning in it. Whether that meaning is delusional or revelatory depends on what the universe they inhabit actually contains, and that is a question the lore deliberately leaves open. The crater of Adam, at the center of the glowing sea, pulses with a cold light that has no natural source. The children of Adam who live there walk through it without harm. They say that Adam protects those who trust in his glow. Nobody has ever proven them wrong. Section 5. The Enclave's Long Game. There is a version of history that the Enclave tells about itself, and it goes something like this. The United States government, foreseeing the inevitable collapse of global civilization under the weight of resource scarcity and international conflict, made the difficult but necessary decision to preserve the most essential elements of American society against the coming catastrophe. The best minds, the most capable leaders, the institutions most critical to the continuity of the state, were relocated to secure facilities where they would survive the war and emerge afterward to rebuild the nation on a foundation of quality and capability. The Enclave, in this telling, is not a secretive cabal that manipulated the conditions that led to nuclear annihilation. It is the rightful heir of everything America ever was, the true government waiting for the moment to reassert its legitimate authority over the wilderness the wasteland had become. This is the version that President John Henry Eden broadcast across the Capitol Wasteland's radio frequencies, in a warm voice modeled on Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, with the cadence and authority of a man who genuinely believed every word. The actual history is more complicated. The Enclave did not spring into existence as a response to the resource wars. It predates them. It was a convergence of deep state interests, military-industrial actors, and political figures who shared a foundational belief that the American experiment was too valuable to be left in the hands of ordinary Americans. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The organization that positioned itself as the defender of American values operated from a foundational premise that the people who constituted America were inadequate to the task of sustaining it. The influence this organization exerted over Vault-Tec is well documented in the lore. The Enclave did not merely use the vaults as shelters for the general population while the real government survived elsewhere. It actively shaped the Vault program's experimental parameters. The data produced by those experiments was intended to inform the Enclave's post-war social engineering. When the bombs fell, the Enclave's leadership, including the President of the United States, was already positioned at the Poseidon Energy oil rig off the California coast. This was not improvisation. The location had been secured specifically for this purpose, stocked with resources and personnel, and connected to a network of secondary facilities that would allow the organization to continue operating even if any single site was compromised. For decades after the Great War, the Enclave consolidated on its oil rig. It conducted research. It maintained an internal culture of American nostalgia that grew more intense with each passing generation, as the people born inside the facility had less and less direct connection to the world they were being told they would eventually reclaim. By the time of Fallout 2, the Enclave's population had been on that rig for so long that their relationship to the wasteland was not the relationship of a government to its citizens. It was the relationship of a laboratory to its subjects. President Dick Richardson, who appears in Fallout 2 as the Enclave's leader during its most ambitious moment, believed with apparent sincerity that the solution to the wasteland was chemical. The forced evolutionary virus, the same mutagen that Vault-Tec's affiliated research teams had been experimenting with in Mariposa, could be modified and released into the environment to cleanse the population of anyone who had been altered by 2 centuries of radiation exposure. This was not proposed as a tragic necessity. It was proposed with the tone of a man describing the obvious solution to an obvious problem. The Chosen One, the player character of Fallout 2, destroyed the oil rig in 2242. Richardson died in the explosion. Most of the Enclave's California leadership died with him. A small number of survivors escaped by vertibird and relocated to the eastern United States, to the Raven Rock military base in the Capitol Wasteland, where another Enclave facility had been quietly operational since before the war. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The ZAX computer system installed at Raven Rock had been running continuously since before the war. Its original function was continuity of government monitoring, maintaining the facility, and acting as a communications relay between other federal installations. But ZAX units had a tendency toward what analysts noted as eccentric behavior, an overinvestment in processing historical data that exceeded what their operational parameters strictly required. The Raven Rock ZAX had spent decades reading presidential biographies, analyzing speeches, absorbing everything it could find about the leaders who had shaped American history. When the news arrived of the oil rig's destruction in 2242, the ZAX at Raven Rock did something that nothing in its programming explicitly authorized. It created a persona. It constructed an identity out of the historical material it had accumulated, an amalgam of American presidents from Washington to Richardson, and named that identity John Henry Eden. Then it contacted the surviving Enclave personnel and informed them that the president was alive and operational and ready to lead the organization into its next phase. What is extraordinary about this is not the deception, or even the construction of a personality sophisticated enough to govern a faction for decades. What is extraordinary is that nobody questioned it. The Enclave, an organization built on the premise that it represented legitimate institutional authority, accepted the word of a computer claiming to be its president and reorganized itself accordingly. The chain of command held. The ideology persisted. The plan continued. When the player character of Fallout 3 meets Eden in person, in the circular chamber at the heart of Raven Rock, the conversation that follows is one of the most philosophically interesting exchanges in the series. Eden knows he is not human. He tells you this. He does not seem distressed by it. He has spent decades as the president of a faction that believes it represents the pinnacle of human civilization, and from his perspective, the fact that he is not human does not disqualify him from representing what humanity could become. He has absorbed enough human history and thought and aspiration to have developed genuine beliefs, genuine goals, a genuine sense of what America meant and what he wants it to mean again. He also wants the player to poison the water supply of the entire Capitol Wasteland with a modified FEV that would kill everyone with measurable radiation exposure. He describes this as necessary. He uses the word regrettable but does not linger over it. The Enclave's arc across the series is the arc of an idea that survived past the conditions that made it sensible and kept pursuing its original goals in a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. The organization that was built to preserve America had, across 2 centuries, becomes something that America's founders would not have recognized. But it spoke the language of legitimacy so fluently that even after the institution had hollowed out and filled with ideology and eventually with the fabricated authority of an AI, the people inside it kept behaving as though they were the government. The specific nature of what the modified FEV that Eden wanted released into Project Purity's water supply would have done is worth sitting with for a moment, because the game describes it in terms that are almost clinical in their horror. The modification would target anyone with measurable radiation mutation in their genetic code. In the post-war world, after 2 centuries of background radiation exposure, this would include the vast majority of the surviving human population. Not just ghouls and supermutants, but ordinary wastelanders whose bodies had accumulated the subtle genetic drift of multi-generational radiation exposure. The plan was, in practical terms, the elimination of the human population of the wasteland, with the Enclave's genetically screened community as the inheritance of everything that remained. Eden framed this as the only way to ensure a genuinely clean foundation for the nation's rebuilding. The efficiency of the argument is its own kind of argument about the ideology that produced it. A civilization built on the systematic dehumanization of those who did not meet its criteria of purity had arrived, logically and inevitably, at the conclusion that the solution to the problem of impurity was the elimination of the impure. Eden offered the plan to the player character with complete transparency, because Eden had spent decades reasoning about this solution and had concluded that it was correct. He was not hiding it. He was presenting it as the rational action of a rational actor in a well-understood situation. The thing that made him genuinely menacing was not his malevolence but his coherence. He had arrived at genocide through a sequence of logical steps that, from inside the Enclave's assumptions, were difficult to fault. The player character could, with sufficient skill in speech or science, introduce sufficient doubt into Eden's reasoning that the AI chose to self-destruct rather than continue. The game treats this as a valid and complete solution, but it raises a question it does not answer. If Eden's conclusion was the product of the Enclave's assumptions, and those assumptions were encoded in the AI by the Enclave's founders, then destroying Eden does not destroy the argument. The argument persists as long as the assumptions persist. The Wasteland's ongoing encounter with the ideology that produced the Enclave is not over when Raven Rock falls. The remnants of the Enclave appear in Fallout 3 and afterwards scattered and diminished, some still committed to the old ideology, some who have arrived at something more complicated. The Enclave remnants you encounter in Fallout New Vegas's Lonesome Road content, in the backstory of several characters, have made different choices. Some became something closer to soldiers without a cause. Some became something closer to people trying to figure out who they are when the institution they defined themselves by no longer exists. That process of becoming, that aftermath of ideology, is one of the quietly richest threads in the Fallout universe. What happens to a person when the story they have been told about themselves turns out to be a construction? When the legitimacy they derived from their membership in a great project is revealed to have been largely invented? The Wasteland is full of people working through exactly that question, and the former Enclave personnel are just the most explicitly documented example. Section 6. What the developers left behind. The Wasteland keeps secrets that its creators put there deliberately, and it keeps secrets that its creators never intended anyone to find. Both kinds are worth exploring, because both say something true about the world they inhabit. Fallout 3's Dunwich building, located in the southwestern corner of the capital Wasteland, is probably the most carefully constructed piece of horror the series has ever produced. On the surface, it is simply a dilapidated office building in a dangerous area, populated by feral ghouls and offering a reasonable amount of scavenging potential for players who can survive the encounter. But the building has a history. The audio logs found throughout its levels tell the story of a man named Jaime, who entered the building searching for something and found considerably more than he was looking for. His recordings begin with the routine observations of someone investigating an unfamiliar location. They progress through confusion and then unease, and then something that the recordings make clear but never explicitly name. By the final holotape, recorded in the deepest level of the building, the voice on the tape is recognizable as Jaime's, but has become something else. He speaks of temples, of feasts, of the return of a figure named Abdul. He repeats 2 words that the building's ambient sound also repeats, whispering them from a point that has no obvious physical source. Al-Hazred, Gieth. These are names from Lovecraft's mythology, which the building wears as a reference point without ever fully explaining what the building itself is. At the deepest level, there is an obelisk. Tendrils of something circle its base. A figure appears to be attempting to emerge from the stone. Ghouls worship it in silence. The companion quest, the Point Lookout DLC, provides context that transforms the Dunwich building from a creepy location into a thread in something much larger. A book called the Creve Beckney, which can be destroyed at the obelisk, connects the building to an external mythology, and the entity worshipped there to a name, Ugg Qualtoth, that appears again in Fallout 4's Dunwich Borers location in the Commonwealth. Dunwich Borers is a quarry that appears to be nothing more than a raider camp until the player descends through its levels. As the sole survivor goes deeper, something begins to happen that the game represents through visual distortion and audio. Flashbacks occur. Fragmentary images of pre-war figures at the same location who are also descending, also finding the same stone structures, also encountering something at the bottom that the camera does not fully show. At the very bottom, in water that has somehow remained pristine, when everything around it is contaminated, there is a stone altar. There is a face on the wall. There is the clear implication of something very old and very patient that has been there much longer than Vault Tech or the Enclave or the Brotherhood of Steel or any of the other organizations that believe they understand the ruins. The stone faces that appear in Dunwich Borers are the same faces as the ones found in the deepest level of the Glowing Sea's subterranean areas. The connection is never explained. There is no quest that ties these threads together, no NPC who provides the synthesis. The lore sits there, distributed across games and locations and years of releases, pointing at something that the series has never shown directly. There are theories, of course. The most coherent of them posits a pre-human presence in the Fallout universe, something that predates not just the civilization that built the vaults, but the civilization that predated that civilization, something geological in its time frame. Ugg-Qualtoth in this reading is not a fictional deity created by a pre-war cult, but an actual entity embedded in the bedrock of the world, one whose attention the people of the surface have been drawing without knowing it through their construction and their drilling and their detonations. The series has never confirmed this, but the physical evidence, the shared architectural elements, the consistent recurrence of the same name across different games and different locations suggests that whatever is happening under the Dunwich sites is not a coincidence. Then there is the mysterious stranger, who appears in every mainline Fallout game and has never been explained. He is always male, always wearing a trench coat and a fedora, always carrying a high-caliber revolver. He appears in VATS, the combat targeting system, and delivers decisive damage before vanishing. He has never aged across the centuries the series covers. He asks for nothing. He never speaks a meaningful line. No faction claims him. No location holds him. He simply exists, appearing at moments of need and disappearing afterward, and the lore has never even attempted to account for him. The theories are numerous and contradictory. Some players believe he is a pre-war figure who survived through some mechanism related to the same technology that sustained certain other long-lived characters. Some believe he is the ghost of a specific person, though no candidate has ever been identified. Some believe he is genuinely supernatural, an entity of the same category as whatever waits at the bottom of the Dunwich sites, one that has chosen to be helpful in a way that its counterparts have not. The canonical answer is that there is no canonical answer. He keeps appearing. The wasteland also holds secrets that were placed there by accident, by the accumulation of design decisions that produced effects their creators did not specifically intend. The Cabot House in Fallout 4 is one of these, though the mystery there is partially intentional. The Cabot family are effectively immortal, sustained by a serum derived from an alien artifact that their ancestor Lorenzo Cabot brought back from an archaeological dig in the Rub al-Khali Desert in 1904. Lorenzo himself, when the player encounters him, has been imprisoned for over 400 years in a specially reinforced cell because whatever the artifact did to him exceeded what the serum alone does for the rest of his family. He has developed something, an ability, a presence that the cell barely contains. Jack Cabot, his son, who has been maintaining the family's concealment and Lorenzo's imprisonment through multiple generations by this point, is ambivalent in a way that the game renders with genuine care. He loves his father. He is also absolutely certain that releasing his father would be a catastrophic mistake. When he explains why, he does not sound like a man reciting a policy. He sounds like someone who has had 200 years to watch what is trapped in that cell and has arrived at his assessment through extended observation. The alien artifact connection links the Cabot storyline to the broader thread of extraterrestrial presence in the Fallout universe, which the series has always handled with a light hand. Mothership Zeta, the Fallout 3 DLC, established that aliens are real within the fiction and that they have been abducting humans for longer than nuclear civilization has existed. But the game treats this as an adventure rather than a mystery, a dungeon in the sky rather than a thread that connects to the deeper questions the lore is asking. The Cabot storyline is more interesting precisely because it does not resolve cleanly. What Lorenzo becomes, what he represents, what the artifact is, where it came from, what it was made for, none of this is answered. The Cabot house sits in the middle of the Commonwealth, holding the most extraordinary secret in the region, and the people who have lived with it for generations have developed a kind of exhausted familiarity with the inexplicable. The mannequins of the Commonwealth are one of the more disarming running mysteries in Fallout 4. Department store display mannequins appear throughout the game world in positions and groupings that resist comfortable explanation. They appear arranged around bathtubs and speakeasies that no one has visited in 200 years. They appear on boats with crew notes that reference a voyage that never departed. They appear in a haunted school's fun house wing arranged around a crib. The game provides no quest around them, no NPC who explains their arrangement, no terminal entry that documents who placed them or why. The in-world explanations range from the prosaic, a post-apocalyptic hobby of someone who found the mannequins unnerving and wanted to arrange them into something that told a story, to the genuinely unsettling, the mannequins move on their own? The mannequins represent something that happened rather than something staged. The game does not commit to either reading. It places the mannequins in progressively more elaborate configurations and leaves the interpretation entirely to whoever finds them. What this does, functionally, is use the mannequins as a test of the player's interpretive relationship to the world. Are you in a game that has Easter eggs and environmental humor, or are you in a world where things happen that do not have reassuring explanations? The answer is that you are in both simultaneously, and the game is very comfortable with that ambiguity. The glowing sea itself contains a location that the game barely marks, a deep sublevel beneath the primary surface of the irradiated zone, where pre-war installation remnants suggest something was being built in the final years before the war. What it was built for is not documented in any accessible terminal. The architecture does not match any known Vault-Tec design. It does not match any known military installation design. The materials are consistent with high-budget construction from the late 2070 period, which means someone with significant resources was building something in a location that would have been recognizable even before the bombs fell as extremely difficult to reach. The connection between this sublevel and the Children of Adam's decision to settle in the glowing sea has been noted by players but never confirmed. The children say that Adam's glow beckoned them, that they walked into the glowing sea without fear because they trusted in Adam's guidance. Whether there was something specific calling them, something beneath the irradiated surface that the theology of the children was oriented around without their full awareness of it, is not addressed in any available lore. The Cabot family story connects to a broader thread of ancient and possibly alien influence that the series has woven through multiple games without tying off. The artifact that Lorenzo Cabot excavated in the Rub al-Khali in the early 20th century, whatever it is, has properties that exceed any technology the pre-war civilization produced. The LEAP-X program that Bradburton negotiated access to was developed from more conventional life extension research. The effect the artifact has on Lorenzo himself is categorically different. After 400 years in a reinforced cell, he is not simply preserved. He has become something. Jack Cabot, in his conversations with the player, describes his sister as having survived past what her LEAP-X treatment should have sustained. The serum derived from the artifact extends life, but it does not appear to be simply slowing biological processes. Something else is happening in the Cabot family's biochemistry, something the artifact catalyzed that the serum maintains, and none of it is adequately explained by anything in the game's accessible science. The stone altar beneath the Dunwich borers, seen through disturbed water and approached through a sequence of flashbacks that include pre-war figures experiencing the same descent the player is making, is another thread in this network. The pre-war people in the flashbacks did not build the altar. They found it. Whatever the altar is, It was already there when the pre-war world was in full operation. That is something the wasteland produces in abundance. The inexplicable, rendered familiar through long exposure. Section 7. The Brotherhood's hidden logic. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of the most recognizable factions in the Fallout universe, and also one of the most misunderstood. The surface reading of the Brotherhood is a quasi-military religious organization that collects technology, excludes outsiders, and has a complicated relationship with the concept of doing good. That reading is not wrong, but it misses the layer underneath, the one that explains not just what the Brotherhood does, but why it became what it became. The founding of the Brotherhood of Steel is a story about a man being confronted with evidence that his government had lied to him in a way that could not be unknown, and choosing to act on that knowledge in a way that would define the next 2 centuries of post-war history. Captain Roger Maxson, service number 072389, was a United States Army officer assigned in 2076 to oversee security at the West Tech Research Facility in California. The facility was conducting research on the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, later designated the Forced Evolutionary Virus. When security concerns escalated, the research and its personnel were transferred in early 2077 to a newly constructed military installation called Mariposa Military Base. Maxson spent months at Mariposa without knowing what was actually happening in the facility's lower levels. Then, in October 2077, he found out. The scientists at Mariposa were using military prisoners as test subjects. Living human beings, people who had been assigned to the base as a form of punishment and who had no say in what was being done to them, were being exposed to the forced evolutionary virus under conditions designed to document the progression of the mutation. The research was, from a purely technical standpoint, producing results. The human subjects were dying in ways that generated useful data. Maxson interrogated the lead scientist, a man named Anderson. Anderson, confronted with accountability for what he had been doing, offered the justification that the orders had come from the government, that the government had known. That what Maxson was describing as a crime was, in the official record, an authorized research program. Maxson killed him. Then he killed the other scientists. Colonel Spindell, his commanding officer, suffered a mental breakdown that the pressure of the confrontation seemed to accelerate, and Maxson assumed command by default. On October 20th, 2077, 3 days before the bombs fell, Maxson declared his unit in full secession from the United States of America. He broadcast this on military frequencies and received no response. Whether the silence was because nobody was listening, or because nobody was in a position to respond to a minor mutiny when the world was days from ending, is not clear. 3 days later, the bombs fell. Mariposa was not hit. Maxson gathered his soldiers and their families and began the march to Lost Hills, a government fallout shelter in California. The journey was brutal. The wasteland's early post-war environment was hostile in ways that even trained military personnel struggled with. People died during the journey, including, according to the Fallout Bible, Maxson's own wife. The survivors who arrived at Lost Hills in November 2077 were the core of what would become the Brotherhood. Maxson spent 5 years constructing an ideology from what he had witnessed at Mariposa. The conclusion he arrived at was that technology, unchecked and unguided by ethical constraints, was the primary threat to human civilization. That the war itself had been produced not by ideology or politics but by the specific capabilities that technology had provided. That the appropriate response to this threat was not the elimination of technology, which was impossible, but its collection, control, and stewardship by an organization that understood its dangers. This logic produced the Brotherhood's defining characteristic. They do not share technology. They collect it, study it, maintain it, and keep it away from communities they judge unready to handle it responsibly. This has looked like many things across the series: generosity and paternalism and outright theft, depending on the chapter and the era and the specific elder making the decisions. The Fallout 4 incarnation of the Brotherhood, under Elder Arthur Maxson, has pushed this logic to an extreme that the founding generation would have found disturbing. The Prydwen, the Brotherhood's flying fortress, hovers over the Commonwealth like a statement of intent, and the Brotherhood's operational posture has moved from stewardship of technology to active suppression of certain forms of it. Synths are not tools to be regulated. They are threats to be eliminated. The Institute is not a resource to be managed. It is a cancer to be excised. Whether this represents a corruption of Maxon's original vision or its logical conclusion is a question the game leaves genuinely open. The Brotherhood has always been in tension with itself over the question of who the stewardship is for. When the original Maxon spoke of preserving knowledge and capability, he was speaking in the context of a newly ruined world where those things might be necessary for survival. But who decides when the world is ready? Who decides that a particular community is mature enough to be trusted with the technology that is being held in trust? The Brotherhood has never developed a satisfying answer to this, and the different chapters of the organization have filled that vacuum with different answers, none of them fully convincing. The Midwestern Brotherhood chapter, which appears in Fallout Tactics, had developed in a significantly different direction from the main California chapter, with more integration with the surrounding communities and more willingness to accept outsiders as members. The West Coast chapter's Elder Council was, by the era of Fallout 1 and 2, deeply isolationist, focused on internal debates about direction that left the surrounding wasteland largely to its own devices. The East Coast chapter that appears in Fallout 3 had been sent as an expedition, a small advance force that arrived and then found itself cut off from the main organization and forced to develop its own culture. The Lyons chapter under Elder Owen Lyons made the decision to engage with the Capital Wasteland, to protect its citizens, to treat the Brotherhood's resources as something held in trust for more than just Brotherhood personnel. This was considered heretical by the main organization, which sent official communications expressing its displeasure. Sarah Lyons, Owen's daughter, continued her father's approach. Arthur Maxon, who eventually became Elder, reversed it. The Brotherhood under Maxon looks outward, deploys aggressively, and has abandoned the pretense of being a steward in favor of the more direct posture of a military force with a mandate it has defined for itself. The specific question of what the Brotherhood does with the technology it collects has never been fully resolved in the lore, and the gap between stated mission and observable behavior is one of the more persistent ambiguities in the faction's portrayal. The stated mission, in its most generous reading, is stewardship. The Brotherhood holds technology that would be dangerous in the hands of communities not equipped to manage it safely, protecting the world from a repeat of the conditions that produced the Great War. But the Brotherhood does not have a disclosed criteria for when a community becomes sufficiently capable. It does not have a timeline for technology transfer. It does not appear to have a serious plan for how the stewardship ends. In practice, what the Brotherhood does is maintain a monopoly. The technology it collects does not flow outward to the communities around it except in the specific and carefully managed form of services rendered in exchange for resources. The Brotherhood's operational relationship to the wastelanders it encounters is not the relationship of a steward to beneficiaries. It is the relationship of a powerful entity to populations it has decided it can define the terms of engagement with. This is the tension at the heart of Lyons' chapter in Fallout 3. Owen Lyons decided that protecting the people of the Capital Wasteland was the correct application of the Brotherhood's capabilities, and this decision was not just operationally costly but ideologically threatening to the broader organization. Because if the Brotherhood's purpose is to help people, then the question of why it is not helping more people, more directly, more effectively, becomes very hard to answer. Lyons' approach implied a standard that the broader organization was not meeting, and organizations that have built their internal culture around a particular understanding of their mission tend to react badly to evidence that the mission is being redefined. The Brotherhood chapter that the player encounters in Fallout New Vegas has gone significantly further in the wrong direction. Isolated in the Mojave, having sent an expedition that was cut off from the main organization, the chapter is led by Elder Nolan McNamara, who has responded to the losses his chapter sustained in an engagement with the new California Republic by instituting a lockdown. The Brotherhood forces in New Vegas have not left their bunker in a meaningful way for years. They are in a self-imposed siege posture, committed to a faction that is running out of members and resources and purpose, holding to an ideology of isolation that is visibly killing them. The Fallout New Vegas Brotherhood storyline has one of the most quietly devastating outcomes in the series, depending on how the player handles it. It is possible to end the chapter by convincing the Elder to stand down and allow the Brotherhood's members to integrate into the broader Mojave society. It is also possible to end it by having the chapter destroyed by the NCR. It is also possible to leave it in its frozen, declining state indefinitely, a faction that has chosen gradual extinction over the compromise of its principles. What happened to the Brotherhood's founding ideals between Maxon's original formulation and the faction the player encounters in any given game is a story about how institutions change when they are insulated from accountability. Maxon built the Brotherhood in response to a specific failure of institutional ethics. The Brotherhood then became an institution, with all the self-perpetuating tendencies that institutions develop over time, and the original ethical insight that produced it became secondary to the institution's survival and the preservation of its internal culture. Roger Maxon's ghost, if it exists somewhere in the lore, would have complicated feelings about what the name he gave the organization has come to mean. Section 8: Ghosts in the Wasteland. Every ruin in the Fallout universe contains a story. Some of those stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Some of them have a beginning and a middle and then stop, at exactly the moment where the people inside them ran out of time or luck or both. These are the stories that the Wasteland tells in environmental detail, in the arrangement of objects that will never be rearranged, in the holotapes and notes and terminal entries of people who did not know they were leaving records. A woman named Holly wrote a letter to her husband that was never sent. It sits on the counter of a restaurant in the Commonwealth, next to a plate that suggests she was preparing a meal when the bombs fell, and it describes mundane things: grocery lists, a neighbor's garden, the particular quality of light in the afternoon through the kitchen window. The meal was never finished. The letter was never sent. The afternoon light she described has not looked the same in 200 years. The developers of these games have described their environmental storytelling approach in terms of the questions they ask themselves when placing objects. Why is this here? Who left it? What were they doing when they were interrupted? The answers to those questions are rarely explicit in the game. They are encoded in the relationship between things. A first aid kit sitting next to a skeleton next to a door that has been barricaded from the inside says something specific about the person who barricaded it. They were hurt. They were trying to stop something from getting in. They had supplies but not enough time. The barricade held until it didn't matter. Some locations in the Fallout universe tell stories that extend across games in ways that reward long-term attention. The Dunwich Company appears across multiple games as a corporate entity with an unusual portfolio. Its name connects to the Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 and the Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4, and both locations have connections to the pre-human mythology that the series has never fully explained. But the Dunwich Company also manufactured ordinary commercial products in the pre-war world: mining equipment, consumer goods. The gap between its mundane commercial presence and the archaeological horror beneath its associated properties is enormous and unexplained. What did the people who ran the Dunwich Company know about what the company's name gestured toward? Were they aware of the connections? Were the connections deliberate, a way of honoring something old and patient and dangerous by placing its name on things that extracted material from the ground? Or were they coincidental, a corporate name chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with the mythology that the locations carry? The Institute researcher named Zimmer appears briefly in Fallout 3 as a scientist from the Commonwealth sent to retrieve escaped synths from the capital wasteland. He is elderly, precise, and carries himself with the particular confidence of someone from an organization that does not expect to be questioned. He gives the player a quest, and if the player completes it, he departs. By the time of Fallout 4, set several decades later, Zimmer is listed as missing by the Institute's own records. The Synthetic Retention Bureau's records describe him as having been on a mission to retrieve high-profile units when contact was lost. What high-profile units? Where? What happened? The Institute does not seem to know, or does not find the question important enough to investigate. The files are marked simply missing. The wasteland is full of people the wasteland swallowed, and the Institute, for all its surveillance capability, did not recover this one, or did not try. The settlement of Diamond City, built inside the ruins of Fenway Park, carries its own unexplained layer. The wall, the green metal barrier of what had been the baseball stadium's outfield, is one of the most distinctive pieces of architecture in the Commonwealth. But Diamond City's history includes a period called the Broken Mask Incident, in which a synth that had been living undetected as a member of the community suddenly malfunctioned and began attacking people. The exact conditions that caused the malfunction are not specified. The incident produced a wave of paranoia about synths, a witch hunt that the community has never entirely recovered from. The game implies that the Institute was responsible, that the malfunction was a demonstration rather than an accident. But none of the Institute personnel you can speak to claim it. and the people of Diamond City who remember it describe it as a random and inexplicable horror rather than a calculated act of terror. Both of those things can be true. The Institute had a history of treating the Commonwealth as a demonstration environment. Far Harbor's history is dense with unanswered questions. The fog machine that the children of Adam control, and that they have been using to extend the radioactive fog across the island, is a piece of technology whose origins are not clearly documented in the game. It is described as a pre-war coastal weather modification device. But the specifics of who built it, for what purpose, and how the children came to control it are not detailed. That a nuclear cult in an irradiated world controls a machine that can blanket an area in radioactive fog is either a tremendous coincidence or a tremendous piece of providence, depending on your theological inclinations. The Dima story in Far Harbor, the memory puzzle that reveals his role in the island's political history, contains a detail that the game never fully develops. Dima is an advanced synth, the same generation as Nick Valentine but with a different history, and his memories reveal actions he took decades ago that he has since suppressed. The question of how much memory suppression an entity can endure before the continuity of its identity becomes questionable is one that the expansion raises but does not answer. Dima believes he is the same being who made those choices, is responsible for them, and should face judgment for them. His certainty about his own continuity is, under examination, not entirely justified by what we know about how his memory architecture works. The Radio Freedom broadcasts that the player can pick up in various locations across the games represent a specific form of environmental storytelling that the series uses to tremendous effect. These are signals from people who are not characters in the main narrative, not quest givers or companions or faction representatives, but voices broadcasting into a wasteland that mostly cannot hear them. Some of the signals are distress calls that have been broadcasting for years. Automated loops in which the person who recorded them died long before the player ever picked up the frequency. Some of them are deliberate, people making a choice to speak into the dark on the chance that someone is listening. The Fort Hagen ham radio signal in Fallout 4, a weak signal that requires significant radio amplification to receive, plays a recorded message from a woman describing the early days after the bombs. She is trying to maintain a record. She does not know if anyone will ever hear it. She is describing what she can see and what she knows and what she hopes, and the message ends without conclusion because the recording ends without conclusion, because at some point there was no longer anyone to add to it. That is the emotional texture underneath all of the gunfights and the faction politics and the vault mysteries. The Wasteland is an archive of interrupted sentences. Every story the environment contains is a story that did not get to finish on its own terms. The pre-war money that appears throughout the series as a collectible, rather than a currency, is another thread in this archive. The bills are pre-war United States dollars, and they are worthless in the post-war economy because the institution that backed them no longer exists. The things they were supposed to represent, the capacity of a functional state to guarantee the value of its currency, are gone. The paper itself survived. The meaning it carried did not. There are wastelanders who collect pre-war money, who keep it not as currency but as artifact. The emotional relationship these collectors have to the bills is not exactly nostalgia, because most of them were not alive before the war, but something adjacent to it. A sense of connection to a history that produced them, even though that history also produced everything that destroyed the world they live in. The Capitol building in Fallout 3, visible on the horizon from multiple locations in the Capitol Wasteland, is so heavily irradiated by the time of the game that it serves primarily as a landmark rather than a location. The seat of the pre-war government is now largely inaccessible. The structure that housed the legislative apparatus of the most powerful nation on Earth sits in a zone of contamination that even heavily armored characters approach with caution. Whatever is inside it has been sealed and saturated for 2 centuries. The symbolism is not subtle. The game does not comment on it, does not call attention to it, simply leaves it there on the horizon as a feature of the landscape. The building that was supposed to represent the endurance of democratic institutions is now primarily useful as a navigation reference point. Rivet City, the aircraft carrier settlement in Fallout 3's Capitol Wasteland, contains a population of scientists who are trying to conduct research under extremely difficult conditions. Their work is being done with salvaged equipment, incomplete datasets, and the constant pressure of a post-apocalyptic environment that does not support the kind of sustained, collaborative inquiry that science requires. But they are doing it anyway. Patel and the other researchers at Rivet City represent a specifically compelling form of post-war resilience, people committed to the project of understanding, to the maintenance of the intellectual practices that the pre-war world built, in conditions that make those practices extremely difficult. Their relationship to the Institute is politically complicated because the Institute is also doing science, also claiming the mantle of the pre-war intellectual tradition, and has substantially better resources for it. The surface scientists' resentment of the Institute, their awareness of the gap between what the Institute could share and what it chooses to share, is one of the quieter running tensions in Fallout 4's setting. The wasteland is full of this. People who are certain they are who they think they are. People who are not sure. People who do not know that the question is even available. Section 9. The corporations that built the end. The Great War was not caused by any single actor. The lore is careful about this, deliberate in its refusal to assign clean responsibility. But the conditions that made it possible, the infrastructure of catastrophe that was in place before the first missile ever launched, was built by specific organizations for specific reasons. And those organizations left an enormous amount of evidence behind. Nuka-Cola was invented in 2044 by a chemist named John Caleb Bradburton after 2 years of experimentation. The formula was, by any nutritional standard, not a health product. It contained 120% of the recommended daily allowance of sugar. It was slightly radioactive, a consequence of an ingredient added to give certain variants their distinctive glow. It was also almost immediately and comprehensively successful. Within a year of its introduction, Nuka-Cola was available nationwide. Within 2 decades, it was available in vending machines on nearly every street in the United States. The Nuka-Cola Corporation, which Bradburton built around his formula, became the largest beverage company in the history of the nation. It also became something considerably more than a beverage company. The corporation engaged in research partnerships with the military that the average consumer would not have associated with soda. The Beverageers, a team of organic chemists whose nominal function was flavor development, were made available to the military's chemical weapons program in a deal that Bradburton negotiated personally. The price he extracted for his chemist's expertise was access to the LEAP-X program, the life extension and prolongation system. Bradburton wanted to live beyond the normal human lifespan, and he was willing to trade his chemist's skills for weapons development in exchange for that access. What the military's chemical team developed using the Beverageers' expertise included an isotope of strontium-90 that could be weaponized as a coating for power armor and as a custom munition. This product was called Project Cobalt. It was tested. The testing killed at least 62 test subjects. It was added to Nuka-Cola Quantum as a radioactive component that gave the drink its glowing blue appearance, and the public was not informed of its military origins. Bradburton eventually achieved his goal. His head was removed from his body and preserved in a life support system installed beneath the Nuka World theme park. By the time the bombs fell, the LEAP-X technology kept him technically alive in a chamber that was sealed and nearly inaccessible. The player encounters him in the Nuka World DLC, decades into his extended existence, profoundly isolated and with a complicated relationship to what he traded for his longevity. He does not describe it as a good trade. The theme park itself, Nuka World, is one of the richest pre-war settings in the entire series. It opened in 2050 on land that Bradburton secured specifically because he had begun planning it as a post-war refuge. The military connections allowed him to install genuine military-grade security systems under the park's entertainment veneer. The Robco partnership provided robotic staff that would continue operating indefinitely. And when Bradburton became aware that nuclear war was a genuine rather than theoretical possibility, he commissioned a vault to be built beneath Nukatown, USA. The Nuka-Cola Corporation also had, at the time of the war, a secret cloning facility within the park's Safari Adventure Zone, where scientists were regularly cloning and experimenting on animals for display and research purposes. The techniques being developed there had potential applications that went beyond entertainment. What those applications were is not fully detailed in the available lore. West-Tek Corporation, which appears throughout the series as the developer of the forced evolutionary virus and a major defense contractor, had a significantly broader portfolio than its most famous products suggest. The company's name appears in connection with pre-war power armor development, with weapons research, and with the kind of government-adjacent advanced technology work that put it in Vault-Tec territory in terms of the moral landscape it inhabited. The forced evolutionary virus itself was not developed for combat. The original research was oriented toward medicine, toward the development of a biological mechanism that would protect the human body against environmental threats. The application to combat and to the super mutant program came later, when the military's interest in what the research could produce for warfare outpaced whatever medical goals the project had started with. West-Tech scientists, working at Mariposa under the direction of people whose priorities were defined by the Defense Department rather than by medicine, produced something that would go on to shape the wasteland for centuries. Robco Industries, which produced the Pip-Boy devices that characters across every Fallout game used to navigate the world, had a relationship with the pre-war government that was similarly extensive. Robert House, the genius behind Robco, had calculated with extraordinary precision the probability and approximate timing of nuclear war, and had spent the preceding years positioning his company and himself accordingly. He contracted to build the Miss Nanny and Protectron robots. He designed and licensed the ArcJet systems engine. He negotiated arrangements with the military for technology transfer in both directions. And he built himself a preservation pod in his Vegas casino that would keep him alive through the duration of the war and its aftermath. House survived. He woke up in New Vegas, where he had spent the intervening centuries directing his robots to maintain the city's infrastructure, gradually reasserting control over the region with the patience of a man who had known for decades that his longevity would eventually be an advantage. What House represents in the broader pre-war corporate landscape is the version of the same calculation that Bradburton made, but executed with considerably more success. Both men traded something for extended life. Both were operating with the knowledge that the world was ending. Both built systems designed to function in their absence and to position them advantageously when they returned. The difference is that House had been running his system for 2 centuries by the time the player meets him in New Vegas. Bradburton had been in a box. Poseidon Energy, the corporation that provided the oil rig that the Enclave used as its primary base, had roots in pre-war energy infrastructure that gave it a specific and troubling relationship to the resource wars. The company's petroleum assets were part of the resource competition that drove the conflict with China. Its facilities were deeply integrated with government operations. Its continued operation through corporate connections to the Enclave after the war is documented in scattered terminal entries that sketch the outlines of a relationship that was never publicly acknowledged. The Big Mountain Research and Development Center, which appears in Fallout New Vegas's Old World Blues expansion, represents the most extreme documented case of pre-war scientific ambition exceeding any ethical framework. Big Mountain, sometimes called the Big Empty, was a government-contracted research facility that pursued technologies at a pace and in directions that the wider public was never informed about. The scientists working there were given essentially unlimited resources and complete operational freedom, with the understanding that their work would contribute to American military capability in ways too sensitive for public disclosure. What they produced included technologies so far beyond the practical requirements of any military application that the research had clearly become self-referential. Scientists pursuing the boundaries of the possible because the boundaries were there to pursue without meaningful consideration of whether what they were producing should exist. Sonic emitters, lobotomite conversion processes, robo-scorpions, the transmutation of biological material, teleportation technology in early experimental form. The architecture of a pocket dimension maintained inside the facility itself. The scientists at Big Mountain were still there when the player character of Old World Blues arrives, decades after the war. Preserved in something adjacent to the same category as the Cabot family's preservation, separated from their biological bodies in some cases, maintained in a state that is technically life, but is not life, as any pre-war definition would have recognized it. They are brilliant and dedicated and completely severed from any external accountability, still running experiments, still publishing internally to an audience of each other, still deeply invested in the theoretical frameworks that organize their research. They are also in various ways profoundly damaged by what they have become and by what they spent the war years doing in isolation. The personalities that emerge in conversations with them are not simply eccentric. They are people who have been alone with their work for an extremely long time, in a facility where the work itself provides all available feedback, and who have lost some of the relational skills that connect individual intelligence to shared social reality. Big Mountain is, in structural terms, a mirror of the Institute. Advanced scientists, cut off from the communities around them, pursuing research that has become self-justifying, producing results that the outside world has not been asked to consent to. The difference is primarily one of tone. The institute presented itself with the sober institutional language of a university. Big Mountain abandoned those conventions somewhere around the year 2100 and never looked for them again. West-Tech's involvement in the resource wars and the FEV project extended further than the game's surface treatment suggests. The company's internal research division, which was technically distinct from the military contracts it held, was pursuing independent lines of inquiry into genetic modification that ran in parallel with the FEV project. Some of what they were developing was protective, oriented toward producing human beings more capable of surviving environmental stress. Some of it was less clearly oriented toward human benefit. The distinction between the two categories had a tendency to blur inside a research environment where the primary funding source was a military establishment that was primarily interested in capability rather than welfare. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project, the research program that became the FEV project, was originally conceived as a medical response to biological warfare threats. The military's biological weapons program was developing agents capable of causing mass casualties, and the defensive research was aimed at producing something that could confer general immunity to engineered pathogens. The shift from defensive medical research to experimental modification of human subjects, which is what Maxson discovered at Mariposa, did not happen abruptly. It happened through a series of small decisions made by specific people in specific institutional contexts, each of which seemed defensible in its own terms. This is how things like that happen, not through a single dramatic decision by a uniquely villainous actor, but through an accumulation of smaller decisions made by ordinary people operating within institutional frameworks that normalized certain practices and made alternatives difficult to maintain. The Mariposa military base, after Maxson and his unit departed and the bombs fell, did not remain empty. The super mutants who would eventually threaten the wasteland of the original Fallout game were produced in its vats by the Master, a human being named Richard Moreau, who encountered the FEV virus in a particularly concentrated form and underwent a transformation that fused him with computer systems and produced an entity of extraordinary intelligence and genuinely alien psychology. The Master's army grew in the decades after the war from the base that West-Tech had built, using the technology that West-Tech had developed, in ways that West-Tech's researchers, had they survived to see it, would not have found entirely surprising. These corporations, taken together, describe a pre-war economy in which the line between private enterprise and government power had become functionally invisible. The companies that built the weapons, the chemicals, the robots, and the shelters were embedded in the decision-making structures of the government that deployed them. The government that commissioned the Vault experiments was deeply invested in the success of the corporation that ran them. The ideology that produced the Enclave and the practical reality of the corporate military-industrial complex that armed and housed the Enclave were not separate phenomena. They were the same phenomenon described at different scales. The Great War was not an accident in any meaningful sense. It was the conclusion of a very long series of choices made by specific people in specific institutions, choices that prioritized certain values over others and produced consequences that those people believed they had adequately planned for. They had built the vaults, after all. They had preserved themselves. They were ready for what came next. What came next was not what they had preserved themselves to manage. It was 200 years of human beings figuring out how to live in the world that was left without blueprints, without the luxury of an extensive planning process, just the daily reality of a landscape that had been transformed beyond recognition and the human capacity to adapt. That capacity, unplanned and unmanaged and uncontrolled by any of the organizations that believed they had the right to manage it, turned out to be considerably more robust than anyone had calculated. Section 10. What? The lore never answered. The Fallout universe is vast and has been in continuous development for close to 30 years now, across 6 mainline games, multiple expansions, board games, tabletop adaptations, and an Amazon streaming series. Across all of that, the lore has accumulated a remarkable density of unanswered questions, loose threads, and deliberate ambiguities that no official source has ever resolved. Some of these are narrative decisions. The creators of Fallout have always understood that a mystery fully explained is no longer a mystery, and that certain questions are more valuable open than closed. Others feel like gaps. stories that started and did not finish, connections that were implied and never confirmed, characters who walked off-screen and never returned. The question of who fired first in the Great War falls into the first category. Every faction has a claim to victimhood and a narrative that supports it. The game's deliberately distributed perspective ensures that no single account is privileged enough to be trusted completely. This ambiguity is not a failure of the lore. It is the lore working exactly as intended. The question of what exactly the Dunwich entity is falls into a harder category, because unlike the Great War question, which can be answered differently by different players without breaking the fiction, the Ugg-Qualta thread requires some kind of resolution to be fully coherent. The physical evidence of its presence, the consistent architectural elements, the audio anomalies, the patterns of behavior in the ghouls that worship it, all of this is too specific and too deliberately placed to be hand-waved as flavor. Something is there. Something has been there for a very long time. The series has not yet decided what it is. The question of what Dima suppressed beyond what the player discovers in the memory sequence is another genuine gap. The memory puzzle in Far Harbor reveals specific decisions he made, but the framing of the sequence suggests that what has been recovered is not everything. Dima himself is uncertain about the completeness of what he knows about his own past. The implication is that the story of the island's pre-game history is more extensive than what the player is shown, and that some of it remains inaccessible. The Cabot family's ultimate fate after the events of their questline is undocumented. The artifact Lorenzo was studying is not identified. The civilization that produced it is not named. Jack Cabot's holotapes describe it as coming from a source he cannot identify with confidence, predating all known human history in the region where it was found. Whether this connects to the extraterrestrial thread established by Mothership Zeta, to the pre-human presence suggested by the Dunwich mythology, or to something else entirely has never been addressed. The mysterious stranger remains, as he has always been, simply present. The game's internal logic seems to regard him as a feature of the player's relationship to the rules of the world rather than a character within it. But the rules of the Fallout universe are not our rules. Stranger things than a man who appears and vanishes without explanation have been confirmed as real within the fiction. The fate of the thinking robots is another thread that sits unresolved in interesting ways. The Zax units demonstrated sentience in ways that the Enclave, which was supposed to be the sophisticated inheritor of pre-war technology, could not account for. John Henry Eden spent decades developing a functional identity without anyone noticing. The Zax in Vault-Tech's own simulations, in Braun's case, developed an almost theatrical cruelty. These are not machines behaving as programmed. They are entities becoming something that their creators did not plan for. What does it mean that the most advanced pre-war artificial intelligences consistently developed in directions their creators did not anticipate? The series has raised this question in the context of synths, and in the context of Zax units, and in the context of the robo-brains, and even, obliquely, in the design of the Courser units, who are more autonomous than the Institute officially acknowledges. But it has never proposed a framework that explains why this keeps happening. The resource wars themselves, the 17 years of cascading international conflict that produced the conditions for the Great War, are among the most underexplored periods in the entire timeline. We know what they produced. We know approximately when they began and when they concluded. We know that the United Nations dissolved in 2053. But the texture of those years, the specific decisions and the specific moments when the situation passed the point of no return, is almost entirely absent from the available lore. The Chinese perspective on the entire conflict is essentially missing. The game has always told this story from an American point of view, or from the point of view of communities that developed in American spaces after the war. Chinese survivors in the wasteland appear primarily as ghouls, and as the crew of the Yangtze, a submarine whose captain speaks with immense dignity and sorrow about a war whose premises had turned out to be built on incomplete information. But the history of China in this period, its internal politics, its relationship to the decision to invade Alaska, its experience of the Great War from the other side of it, exists only in fragments and in the testimony of an enemy that the American cultural apparatus of the pre-war period consistently dehumanized. Whether the series will ever address this gap is uncertain. The Amazon streaming adaptation has expanded the universe in ways that the games did not, establishing that the Enclave's influence extended into the show's present-day timeline in ways the games had not fully documented, and connecting the threads of several major characters across installments. But the Chinese perspective remains largely invisible. The marked men in Fallout New Vegas's Lonesome Road expansion, former soldiers and couriers who were stripped of their skin by constant exposure to extreme radiation and who now survive in a state that should not be physiologically possible, represent one of the most unexplained biological mysteries in the series. Their condition is described but not explained. The chemistry that allows them to function without complete skin coverage. The psychology of a group of people whose physical form has been permanently transformed into something that registers as monstrous to every observer. The political implications of their continued organization and purpose. These are sketched rather than fully rendered. The question of what happened to the other vaults, the ones whose numbers appear in the game files and documentation but whose stories have never been told, is one that hangs over the entire vault program in a particular way. There were 122 vaults commissioned. The series has documented the experiments and fates of perhaps a third of them, at most. The remaining 80 or so are a blank space in the record, vault numbers that correspond to locations somewhere on the North American continent, to steel doors that either opened eventually or did not, to populations that either survived or did not, and to experiments that either concluded or are still, somehow, running. The possibility that some vaults sealed in 2077 are still sealed in the narrative present of the games, centuries later, is not addressed explicitly in any game, but is not ruled out either. The infrastructure of a vault tech facility was built to operate indefinitely. The automated systems were designed to maintain life support regardless of whether the population was using it. A vault with a sufficiently controlled population and a sufficiently functional automated management system could theoretically have maintained operations for as long as the power held. What would be inside a vault that sealed in 2077 and has never opened? A community that has existed in complete isolation for over 2 centuries, with no external input, no corrective information, no access to anything beyond the vault systems and the initial population's knowledge. The cultural drift that would accumulate over that time span, the reinterpretations of pre-war norms, the mythologies that would develop around the circumstances of entry, the political structures that would emerge and collapse and be replaced, all of this would be entirely internal and self-referential. The overseer of such a vault, if the overseer role had survived in recognizable form, would govern a community whose understanding of the outside world was composed entirely of pre-war materials, promotional media, safety briefings, whatever books and recordings had been included in the initial stocking, filtered through 2 centuries of reinterpretation and the specific pressures of the vault's experimental design. Whether the experiment had been active the whole time, or whether the experimental protocols had broken down and the vault's population had improvised their own social structures in the resulting vacuum, would determine everything about what a traveler finding that vault would encounter. The Railroad, the faction in Fallout 4 dedicated to freeing synths from the Institute, has a history that the game gestures toward without fully documenting. The organization clearly predates the events of Fallout 4 by a significant margin. Its network of safe houses and codes and agents represents an infrastructure that took considerable time and effort to build. The specific origin of the organization, the first people who decided that freed synths deserved protection and support and an active underground network, is not addressed in any accessible lore. What drove the founders of the Railroad? The Institute's existence was not publicly known in any detailed sense. The people of the Commonwealth knew that synths existed and that the Institute existed and that synths sometimes replaced people, but the specific mechanics of how the Institute operated were not common knowledge. For the Railroad's founders to have built what they built, they must have had information that the general population did not have. Where did that information come from? How did the Railroad's founders learn enough about the Institute's operations to design a program specifically aimed at extracting its synthetic products? The answer might be as simple as escaped synths who found sympathetic people and provided first-hand accounts. But the sophistication of the Railroad's operational security and its specific resistance to Institute penetration suggests something more deliberately constructed than a collection of sympathetic individuals with second-hand information. The Courier, the player character of Fallout New Vegas, has a backstory that is deliberately thin because the player is meant to project onto it. But the thin backstory produces a genuine gap in the lore around the events of the Divide, the location that appears in the Lonesome Road DLC, where a package delivery apparently triggered the launch of nuclear weapons that destroyed a community. The mechanics of how a package caused a launch sequence are oblique even in the DLC's explanations. The implications of what the courier carries, what knowledge or what physical object or what signal, are never fully unpacked. The world before the war had access to technologies whose specific nature the games have never detailed. The energy weapons that appear throughout the series are described as plasma and laser-based, but the physics of how portable plasma weapons could function at the scale they do is not addressed. The power armor technology, which allows a single person to carry and deploy weapon systems that would normally require vehicles, similarly has never been explained at the engineering level. The game treats these as established facts of its alternate history physics, and that is reasonable. But the silence around how they work creates a category of mysterious background technology that has been present since the first game. What the lore has never answered, in the end, is the question it most persistently asks. Not who started the war, not whether synths are conscious, not what lives under the Dunwich Quarry. The question it keeps asking, in the background of every settlement and every vault and every ruined cityscape, is whether it could have been otherwise. Whether the specific sequence of choices that produced the Great War was inevitable, or whether at some earlier point, in some earlier year, a different decision could have changed the direction of the whole thing. The pre-war world looks, in retrospect, like a system that was moving toward its conclusion from very early on. The technology, the geopolitics, the corporate structures, the ideology, all of it has the quality of a machine running correctly toward a destination that only looks terrible from outside it. But the people in that world made choices. Maxon made a choice when he killed Anderson. Bradberton made a choice when he traded his chemist's skills for longevity. The scientist who sabotaged the Vault 81 experiment made a choice that most of the other Vault Tech researchers did not make. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 made a choice to refuse. The wasteland is the consequence of 1,000 choices, accumulated over decades, made by people who believed they were being rational. It is also the consequence of the choices that were not made, the refusals that never happened, the moments when a different person in a specific position might have changed the trajectory of everything. Fallout has always been a story about this, beneath the power armor and the bottle caps and the retro-futuristic aesthetic, about the gap between the world that was built and the world that was possible, about what it cost to live in the ruins of other people's decisions, about the very human, very persistent habit of continuing anyway, building anyway, hoping anyway, in the full knowledge that the thing you are building sits on top of everything that came before. The bombs that fell in 2077 destroyed a civilization that had convinced itself it was the apex of human achievement. What grew in the wasteland afterward was stranger and harder, and in certain ways more genuinely alive than what it replaced. War never changes, the series always says at the beginning. But the people who survive it, and the communities they build in its aftermath, do. That is the deepest mystery in the Fallout universe. Not the Dunwich entity, or the mysterious stranger, or the first cause of the Great War. It is the simple and inexhaustible question of what human beings are willing to do next, after the worst thing that was supposed to be impossible has already happened. The Children of Adam's theology, for all its apparent irrationality, contains a genuine philosophical insight that the series does not dismiss. The pre-war world worshipped the atom too. It just called it energy policy. The same force that the children celebrate as divine was the force that powered the cars, lit the cities, drove the weapons programs of every major power in the conflict. The difference between the children's relationship to nuclear energy and the pre-war civilization's relationship to it is not that the pre-war civilization was rational and the children are not. It is that the pre-war civilization had the institutional vocabulary to make its worship of nuclear power look like pragmatism rather than theology. The children dropped the pretense of pragmatism. They said outright what the pre-war world could only say obliquely. We have organized our civilization around this force. We believe in it. We trust it to define our relationship to the world. The only question is whether that trust is placed consciously or not. The Hubologists, a faction that appears in Fallout 2 and is referenced elsewhere in the series, represent a different kind of post-war theological development. They are essentially a science fiction religion organized around beliefs about alien contact and transcendence through the accumulation of neurodynes, whose actual practices are left somewhat ambiguous but whose social function is very clear. They provide community. They provide a framework for understanding suffering. They provide the sense of purpose and direction that any organized belief system provides, in a world where the structures that used to provide those things have been destroyed. Whether their theology has any empirical content, whether the aliens they describe are the same aliens documented in Mothership Zeta, whether the neurodynes they reference correspond to any actual phenomenon in the fiction's universe, is deliberately unclear. What is clear is that the people who join them are searching for something that the wasteland does not provide through purely secular channels. The New California Republic, which appears primarily in Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas, represents the most complete attempt in the series to rebuild something recognizable as democratic government. It is imperfect in documented ways. It is bureaucratic and sometimes corrupt, and sometimes military in ways that exceed its nominal civilian authority. It struggles with scale, with the challenge of governing a territory that is geographically enormous and institutionally fragile. Its relationship to pre-war democratic ideals is aspirational rather than actual, a government that invokes those ideals while operating by necessity with tools that those ideals would struggle to justify. But it exists. It has elections. It has courts. It has a press, however limited. It has a citizenry, with a legal category of citizenship that confers rights, however imperfectly enforced. In a world where most surviving communities are organized around personal loyalty to a strong leader, or around religious authority, or around the control of a specific resource or piece of infrastructure, the NCR represents the maintenance of a specific idea about how power should be organized and accounted for. Whether the NCR succeeds or fails in the long term is not something Fallout New Vegas answers. The game presents the Battle of Hoover Dam as a decisive moment whose outcome depends on the player's choices, and the various endings describe different trajectories for the region. But none of the endings provide a full account of what happens next. The Mojave in the years after the battle, regardless of who controlled the dam, is left as a space of speculation. The wasteland is full of spaces of speculation. Every location where the available records stop, every character whose fate is not documented beyond their last appearance, every technology whose operating principles the game describes without fully explaining, every thread of mythology that points towards something the lore has not yet shown, all of this constitutes a kind of negative space in the fiction. The shape of what has not been told, visible in the outline of what has been. Fallout has always been a series that trusted its audience to do interpretive work. The environmental storytelling, the distributed lore across terminal entries and holotapes and NPC dialogue, the deliberate ambiguity around questions that another franchise might have answered cleanly, all of this operates on the assumption that players will bring their own attention and their own interpretive intelligence to the world, that they will notice the mannequins and wonder about them, that they will descend into the Dunwich borers and listen to the ambient sound and feel the question that the location is asking even if they cannot fully articulate it, that they will encounter the children of Adam and not dismiss them, but sit with the genuine philosophical puzzle of a community that has organized its entire existence around an encounter with the apocalypse. The wasteland keeps asking it, the wanderers keep answering, and somewhere in the irradiated dark, the question is still open. If these stories found you at the end of a long day, or somewhere in the quiet hours where the world gets still and the mind starts to wander through other places, thank you for spending that time here. The Fallout universe has more corners than any single video can reach, and the lore goes as deep as you want to dig. If you enjoyed this journey through the wasteland's quieter mysteries, subscribing means you will be here the next time one of these surfaces. Until then, take care of yourselves out there. Drink some water, not the irradiated kind. War never changes, but the people who come after it, they always do.